All welcome back to another Sunday School Teacher Workshop. Apologies for kind of being in hiatus mode the last 2 weeks. Last week I was actually speaking at a men's conference about an hour up the road in Columbia, Louisiana, and the week before that here, but sadly we had some technical difficulties with our setup and wasn't able to actually get the sound working, so I think there was a system-wide failure that night, which obviously affected more than just our presentation, I think. So anyway, here we are this week, one of the final remaining Sundays we have of this quarter, and the text that we are focusing on is Luke 13, 22 through 35. And in this particular passage, the highlighted portion that we probably will spend more time, if not almost all of our time on, will be Jesus' mention of the narrow way. Now, before we actually get into the information that's here on the screen, I just want to do a quick little synopsis of what's actually going on in Luke chapter 13. And the reason why I'm doing this is because you're going to see some tidbits of information and text that's coming to us here in Matthew 13. We've already actually seen used before in Luke 13 is where we are. I had Matthew 13 on the brain because I was about to reference that. Some of the things that we're actually going to be looking at here in Luke 13 actually come to us from Matthew 13, which is important. And then, of course, the statement that Jesus makes at the end of this chapter, Matthew utilizes in, the Olivet Discourse of Matthew 24 and 25. And we'll make some use of that too as we go. So anyway, at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus is made aware of the fact that there are some people who were sadly and unfortunately caught up in some circumstances that wound up claiming their lives. Some Galileans who wound up suffering at the hands of Pilate, who slaughtered them while they were attempting to make sacrifices in the temple, and then a separate group of 18 men who were killed in a construction accident in the Tower of Siloam. The point being that Jesus was trying to make clear they didn't do anything to merit that punishment necessarily, and that they, by virtue of that, it wasn't sin that necessarily brought the divine wrath or judgment of God in that circumstance. However, he wanted to use that as a way of pointing out to them that these people who he was surrounded by, whether they are religious and political elites or the poor common people and everybody in between on that spectrum, are not free from experiencing the wrath of God in his vengeance and punishment for sin. A very bold and starkly contrasting statement compared to many of the other things that Jesus has said in Luke's gospel that make him a bit more warm and inviting. One of the reasons perhaps why Luke's gospel is all the time referred to with respect to particular things that Jesus has to say, as goes less threatening sorts of statements. Then right after this, we move into this parable of the fig tree, where Jesus is speaking about a landowner who has now told a tenant farmer, I suppose, that there's a particular fig tree that's been barren now for 3 years. It's just wasting vital nutrients and resources, needs to be cut down. And the landowner makes a plea for the tree to be given one-year extension, and with that, he will make the effort to try to revitalize the soil around the tree, and if at all possible, bring back the tree from what appears to be death. If a tree has gone barren and is not producing fruit for 3 years, certainly one would say, even though it seems to exude signs of life because it continues to bud leaves, it's no longer producing fruit, thereby it's not living up to its purpose. The whole point of this, in connection with what Jesus has just said, with respect to these current events or affairs that he had been made aware of, was that these were all images and, of course, synopsises that pertain directly to the people of Israel, that they were spiritually dead people who were not producing fruit, and they were on the cusp of having the kingdom taken away from them. And, of course, the doors flung wide open for those outside the kingdom, and, of course, that would mean those who are also ethnically Jewish but at a distance from God for various reasons, whether religiously and or sinfully. That being said, then we have a moment where Jesus is in the synagogue and it's on the Sabbath, and of course we know as the stories are framed up for us like this exactly what's about to happen. He is going to heal a woman who has been confined with a spirit of bondage, and with that, the idea is that Jesus is drawing out that this woman has been satanically oppressed through this bodily ailment now for nearly 2 decades. But the people who are witnessing this, while there probably are some in attendance who are more than willing to give joyous praise to God for what has happened, they're not recorded here. Rather, instead, we have the lambasting of Jesus yet again by the synagogue ruler and others who are saying statements like, you have 6 days in the week, come and get your healing any other day, but leave the Sabbath alone, as if to say Jesus is going to be there any other day of the week to heal these people. And Jesus once again draws the sharp contrast as to the distinction between their lack of understanding and their spiritual blindness versus those who clearly see what's going on and are rightfully responding by giving praise to God. Because he's saying, you people are hypocrites. You would easily go out and let your donkey go or your mule or whatever, untie them off the post so that way they can at least get something to drink and not thirst to death while you are doing whatever other business you have on the Sabbath, including coming to synagogue. And so if you are willing to unloose your, or I should say, loosen your donkey from the bondage that it is subjugated to by virtue of being tied up, why in the world would a daughter of Abraham, who has been subjected now these almost 20 years to this particular physical ailment that apparently Jesus is perceiving is in some way tied to the realm of Satan, maybe just because of the brokenness of sin in the world and the fact that disease and ailments exist by virtue of the fall, those particulars and details are left out to us. Instead, what we do understand, though, is that this woman was gloriously healed. And by virtue of that, on the Sabbath, as yet we see so many other instances of these kind of miracles occurring on the Sabbath, it's an invitation to enter into the Sabbath rest of Genesis chapter 2. But these people are rejecting that. So yet again, one more instance where we have Israel failing to understand and rejecting the redemption that Messiah is supposed to bring. Then we move right through two parables that are familiar to us in previous weeks from Matthew 13, and that's the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven. But it's interesting that Luke uses it in the way that he does here, because rather than nestling it into other parables that Matthew does in Matthew 13, which again bolsters the concept of Matthew wanting to paint and picture Jesus as a greater Moses and teaching the way he does, the things he does. Rather, Luke seems to repackage these materials to give a shock and awe value with respect to the concept of the kingdom. And the reason why he perhaps might want to use these particular parables is that no one would be astounded by a mustard seed growing up into a small little bush, which is exactly what a mustard seed does. It does not grow up into this magnificent tree that Jesus is talking about. So outward appearances would make one stop and seem very unimpressed by what they see if this is supposed to be what the kingdom is going to amount to, rather than a tall, stately tree like a cypress, which is exactly what Isaiah and Ezekiel and other prophets were comparing the revitalized kingdom in the Messianic age unto, that it was going to be like this mighty, stately cypress tree. Instead, Jesus is saying it's going to be like this bush, but yet this bush has unique characteristics that really are impossible for it to have. It can be or will be so big that all the birds of heaven are going to come and lodge in its branches. So the kingdom is going to be surprising in its arrival, in its essence and character, and it will seem unimpressive to some, but very impressive to others, depending on the lens that they look with. The same can be said for the bread. And then that leads us into what we're talking about now with respect to the narrow way. So a loose title I would give to this lesson would be, the concept of the narrow way has a prophetic legacy. This is not something that's new or astounding to us if we're very familiar with the concepts of the Old Testament. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to various places in Torah, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, what we'll see here is that the Lord promises over and over again that he will exclude these people from the blessing that he has promised to give them, even on this covenant basis, if they fail to be faithful covenant partners. Leviticus 26 perhaps gives one of the more prolific pictures in the Old Testament that is actually lived out and written about by future biblical authors of what will happen, the devastation that will come on Israel if, based on verse 21 as it starts out, they act hostilely toward God and are unwilling to obey him. Then he is going to unleash on them the plagues of Egypt 7 times over for their sins, sending wild animals, basically unleashing the chaos of creation upon them, so that the order he has given them in the new Eden space he granted by giving Canaan to them is going to be stripped away and destroyed. Moses in Deuteronomy 4 makes it very clear that if they fail to be adequate covenant partners and do not live faithfully and exclusively unto God as they should, then what they will experience is God scattering them amongst all the peoples, which is the very thing that Jesus is living on the other side of 5 centuries before his arrival, on the stage of human history. These people were not only exiled, but then, thankfully, delivered and allowed to go back to their land. Isaiah 10, talking about how the mighty dynasty of David, likened unto a tree, is going to be cut down, and the devastation of the judgment Assyria is going to bring is going to be like destroying a mighty forest, and there will be so few trees left that a child can count them. And watching the devastation that comes when Babylon comes to actually finish off the job Assyria started on the Davidic dynasty in the days of Hezekiah, now in the days of his sons and progeny. When Babylon comes knocking on their door, that when Babylon is finally done with the devastation of Jerusalem, there are so few people left. It's a paltry dozen of a small crowd of poor who were left in charge of what was left behind, who themselves owned nothing. And Jeremiah saying in Jeremiah 42, praying to the Lord, may our petition come before you. Pray to the Lord. I'm sorry. I was just kind of letting my brain rattle for a second there. This is actually the petition of those who are left behind, asking Jeremiah if he would pray to the Lord on behalf of them, this entire remnant, because there are so few of them who actually remain that Jeremiah can seemingly count all of them with his own eyes. Then we jump into the New Testament narrative, and we actually have John speaking about the judgment that God is still intending to bring, as if the judgment through Babylon was not enough, and yet 5 centuries of living in the land, now a period of judgment seems to be upon them once more, and this shadow is looming very close, because he says, even now the axe is at the root of the trees. Or in Matthew 22, Jesus makes it very clear when he says, many are invited to this, but few are actually chosen. So, the point I would make in summarizing all of that up is that when Jesus is using this language of the narrow way, he is creating an exclusory circumstance by which obviously everyone is not going to be invited. It's not chosen. It's not a massive broad highway in which all of humanity will find themselves walking. It doesn't mean there will be so few chosen, as if to say it will be tantamount to what was going on in Jeremiah's day with that remnant that was left behind. It's just to state that in giving the shock and awe value it deserves, those people who were just thinking they had a free ticket to ride are going to have the rude awakening that's coming to them as Jesus makes these particular statements. So I think it's important for us to also consider what's going on in Matthew's gospel to better appreciate what is actually happening here in Luke. After all, the reason why these gospels exist is to harmonize, not perfectly in every way, but to harmonize in some way the accounts of Jesus' life as they're all splashed against the backdrop of the Old Testament and the story of Israel from creation all the way up through exile. And then, of course, watching the diorama that the prophets, namely Isaiah, said would play out when the true and faithful servant who represents Israel will come on the scene and actually lead them into this glorious age as Messiah takes over. So Matthew wants to present Jesus to us as Israel. He's the greater Moses, and he's delivering teaching on a mountain. Now, I think that's important for us to recognize with respect to if Jesus is taking up that mantle, then the idea of what Moses was predicting in the Old Testament is still at play, even though he said very specifically they were going to be scattered amongst the nations. And it had already happened in the days of Babylon and Zedekiah, king of Judah. It's going to happen again once the Romans come, which we see Matthew cluing us into. Of course, Luke will do the same toward the end of their Gospels. Then we have Matthew also pointing out that Jesus seems to be a greater David. He's conquering Israel's true enemy, which happens to be Satan, of course. And with that, we also see that Jesus is taking up the mantle of Joshua, and the foreshadowed picture that that particular Yeshua gives us of what will happen once the Moses figure gives way to the actual conqueror of the promised land. Jesus has inaugurated a new conquest period through his baptism and the calling of 12 disciples, heading up seemingly a new nation of Israel, or a renewed nation of Israel, who now have the mandate to conquer the world after they have taken back the land. But the idea is that they're not going to actually erect a kingdom that's going to stand in material contrast to the kingdom that Rome rules over, or anybody else that's going to wind up taking over this particular little patch of land. Rather, it's a kingdom that stands in spiritual contrast to the principles of these people who've rejected Jesus as their Messiah, their rightful king, claiming they have no king but Caesar. This was Israel's mandate from the beginning, to conquer the world, to be the vine that spills out of the garden that God planted them in Canaan, and to eventually permeate the world, and the sweet, succulent fruit that come from it, filling the world with the joy and wine that would be produced from it as the world comes to know and love God as Israel was supposed to. Matthew also gives us the concept that Jesus is a greater Solomon. He's commended for his wisdom over and over again through his parables that he taught, and especially in places like Matthew 13, where again, parallels here with Luke 13, talking about what the kingdom is like and wrapping it up in mysterious, enigma-filled language where people who are listening with spiritual ears, hence Jesus' phrase, he who has ears to hear, let him hear, will hear and understand, whereas those who don't, it's not given to them to understand what the kingdom is like until they have those spiritual ears to hear with. And then lastly, in Matthew 21 and beyond, Jesus is yet again another Jeremiah. So, as I said, Matthew, Luke, Mark, John, they're all taking Jesus, painting him against the backdrop of Israel, wanting us to see how he's fulfilling the broken mandate that Israel has left behind by taking it up, mending it, and then moving it forward, because it's a righteous mandate. It's what God has said Israel will do. And so therefore Israel must accomplish this, but they have failed to do so in nearly 1,000 years of really not trying very much except for at certain points. And now Jesus is spearheading this effort that is going to succeed by virtue of the church and the gospel of the kingdom taking over the world with the spiritual kingdom that's planted. But Jesus at this particular point in Matthew's gospel is serving as a Jeremiah who's standing in the temple precincts, and he is, as Jeremiah does in Jeremiah 7 and 26, decrying what God did at Shiloh when he allowed the Philistines to destroy the tabernacle is going to be repeated here when he allows the Romans to come and destroy the temple. And of course, he winds up weeping over it, speaking about how Jerusalem is the city that he longed to come and nestle up its inhabitants like a mother hen does her chicks under her wings. But instead, Jerusalem has, rather than being the city of light and the city of the Lord, a holy place where the nations can come, it's become a city of murderers and violent people who only seem to want to kill the prophets in rejecting the message that God has continued to bring through them. So with that in mind, you might ask, well, what in the world does that have to do with Luke 13? Part of it, bleeding over into what we just said, as goes the parallel between Matthew 13, Luke 13, and the use of these parables that speak about the kingdom, and why Luke is repackaging some of that material here and using it in a different way and in a different context than Matthew does with respect to those parables. In Matthew 13, Jesus is actually still in Nazareth, if you consider the chronology of the historicity of Matthew's layout of the gospel and where he geographically has Jesus planted. However, in Luke 13, Jesus left Galilee in Luke 9, and he is making his way toward Jerusalem over a period of nearly 10 chapters and will arrive there through the triumphal entry at the beginning of Luke 19. Moses is the lawgiver and deliverer of Israel out of the spiritual and physical bondage they were experiencing in Egypt to bring them to the cusp of the land before he turns over the reins to Joshua. And some of the final messages that Moses gives to the people is that God is going to bring judgment on them because their hearts remain uncircumcised, their necks stiff. He knows as they have rebelled in his lifetime, they will do so exponentially more so once he leaves them. And he is speaking about the bondage they're going to slip into someday before God ultimately does this deed of circumcising their hearts. That's why at the end of Matthew's gospel, we have the use of this statement of Jesus saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets. And then he says, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, the interesting thing about that is that Luke uses it in an entirely different place. Again, he puts it here at the very end of this particular chapter in Luke 13. And you might ask, well, why is that? Because these are at very different points with respect to the layout of the gospel and, again, the chronicity of events and what's going on Jesus' journey. Because it seems like Matthew has Jesus saying it as he's approaching Jerusalem and almost at the city before the triumphal entry. After the triumphal entry, when Jesus is actually talking about how the city is going to be destroyed when the Romans come. Whereas Luke doesn't even have him there at Jerusalem yet. And instead, what's going on is that Jesus is making his way toward Jerusalem, and he's about to have this showdown. So you might ask, well, why does Luke use this in this way? And better yet, what does Luke intend to seemingly want to prove? Luke is putting Jesus on an entirely different agenda or course of events that's transpiring here. Instead, what we have is him being pictured as the messianic servant figure of Isaiah's oracles and scroll, and the idea that this particular messianic figure is going to be that Davidic descendant, the promised ruling, reigning king that would come and bring in this gilded age that is spoken of once we get to Isaiah 42, then skip ahead to 49 through 55. And then after that, from 56 through 66, we get a picture of two distinct lines of Israel. Notice I'm using quotes here. There's the false Israel in the sense that these people are ethnically descended from Abraham through Jacob. And of course, they are also the remnants of the nations as well that do not want anything to do with God's agenda or plan through this Messiah that's being talked about by Isaiah. Then, and of course, with ethnic Israel who reject this Messiah, they think they are still marching and are in line with God's plan, or just want nothing to do with God. There's a wide spectrum there. Either way, they find themselves locked out of the city that Isaiah speaks of in 65 and 66, with brief hints along the way from 55 onward up to those last two chapters. Then you have true Israel, but true Israel is not just the ethnic descendants of Abraham through Jacob who have fallen in line with this Messiah and want God's agenda and will achieve these objectives He's laid out through this Messiah, but it's also the nations. You got Isaiah 56, the invitation for everyone to come and partake of this house of prayer that's meant to be open for all nations. Even the distant ones, such as the eunuchs, will be invited to become priests in this house, offer sacrifices, and be accepted. So the narrow way is open to all, not just a distinct few. It's open to all. Sadly, a few, in comparison to the many who are not going to be found on it, make the choice to exclude themselves. That being said, it's important, I think, for us to understand how to handle that material. Of course, if we only seemingly want to focus as teachers on the material that we have in front of us that we're actually reading as part of our lesson, then I would encourage you to look here to the green boxes, where Jesus is telling them to make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because I tell you, many who try to enter won't be able once the homeowner gets up and shuts the door. So there's obviously a definite period of time in which people will have this invitation extended to them, but the time will come when they will not. Now, this obviously has some eschatological meanings and undertones, and of course, with that, it's widely open for debate as to when exactly this door is going to be shut. There are many who think that because Jesus was rejected by the Jews, that ultimately by virtue of that, they were not allowed to then experience the entering into the kingdom until such a time there may be a great revival amongst ethnic Jews, yet still future to our own time, prior to the Lord returning. There are some who think the door was never really shut. It's just a matter of corporate blindness for the entire nation, but there will come a time for a great revival before the end. And of course, from the time of Christ until now, there has been a steady influx of Jews who have continued to enter into the kingdom by virtue of accepting the gospel. And Matthew, or Luke here, gives us something somewhat commensurate with what Matthew does with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he wraps up that sermon in chapter 7 with the very stark warning that not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom. And there will be those who have reasons why they should be in, because they prophesied in His name, they performed miracles and cast out demons in His name, and yet Jesus will say, I never knew you. Very similar here, we have these people saying, we ate, drank in your presence, meaning we were accepted at your table, and you even taught in our streets. We openly welcomed you here and accepted your message. But He will say, I tell you, I don't know you or where you're from. Get away from me, all you evildoers. Meaning there was openness on the part of Jesus because He was welcome in their presence to teach. They were welcome in His presence when He was willing to sit down at the table and dine with them. There's no greater expression of intimacy amongst family and friends to be had in the ancient Near Eastern world, and across the world even largely today, than to share a table with someone, because that means you are accepted here with me. But even though there was mutual acceptance, yet still, Jesus is saying in the end of things, I did not know you, because you're not part of me. You chose not to become one of mine for whatever reason, and sadly, unbeknownst to these people, they thought they were in, but they were actually not. Then we have Jesus saying the statement here that is also rendered in Matthew. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. So your house is going to be abandoned to you. And I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you will say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, which actually is a bit interesting with respect to where this lies in Luke's gospel. Because when we move to Luke 19 and we see the triumphal entry occur, These are the very words that are being spoken here. People are saying to Jesus, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, per Luke's itinerary, from 9 to 19 in that gospel, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, aside from the moment where he was in the temple as an infant, and then later on for Passover at the time when his parents were taking him there when he was but a boy. We haven't seen Jesus go back to Jerusalem. Now, according to John's gospel, obviously as an adult, he did multiple times during his actual public ministry coming out as Messiah. That being said, Luke, like the other two synoptic writers, Matthew and Mark, are virtually silent on that. It's just the one time to Jerusalem at the end of the gospel for his triumphal entry, subsequent trial, crucifixion, and then resurrection. But Matthew has this statement at a place that makes sense with respect to the timing of the phrase itself, or I should say the use of the phrase. "You won't see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord,'" and what that means per the use of it in the Old Testament, and how Matthew is sharing that in the context of the Olivet Discourse, which actually begins somewhat in Matthew 23 with his dressing down of the Pharisees and talking about how their judgment's going to come within that generation. And then he carries that language further on into Matthew 24, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem also occurring within a generation. All that to simply say, when Matthew says these words from Jesus' mouth, or gives these words from Jesus' mouth, there is no other time that Jesus comes back to Jerusalem. He's already entered Jerusalem. They've already said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So if we're being honest, if we look at this, unless we attach some sort of eschatological significance to it, and many have written commentaries on this, stating that there will be a future time when he returns to Jerusalem and those words will be uttered again. I have to seek ground on that. It's possible. How do we know it won't happen? Because he has not yet returned. But if we look at it from the lens of Luke's gospel, Luke makes better use of this. Not that it's a better gospel. I'm just simply saying it seems to be more historically accurate with respect to if Jesus really said this on his trip to Jerusalem, then when the people see him as he's coming into the city at the time of the triumphal entry and utter those words, it makes perfect sense, because the idea is that he had not went to Jerusalem since the time he uttered these words. We don't know how far or how much time is going to lapse between the time he says these words and then enters Jerusalem. But then that moment comes. They welcome him into the city. Now, all that to simply say, how do we understand and appreciate the context here of this lesson? Again, narrow way language has a prophetic legacy with respect to what was said through the mouths of Old Testament authors, namely Moses and Isaiah, where God promises judgment, but with that, there is going to be a remnant. There always is a remnant. And so as he continues to sow those seeds and then blossom the fruit that comes from this theological understanding, as moments of exile and exodus play out until a great exile into Babylon and another exodus winds up occurring, it only makes sense that Jesus would give us this here and now, because Isaiah spoke. Hence the reason why I gave the contrasting between Matthew and Luke and how he's portrayed in both Gospels. That as it's spoken about in Isaiah, Messiah is supposed to lead the last and final exodus. That exodus was foreshadowed with them leaving the land of Babylon and coming back to the land of Canaan, or Israel. But that was only a foreshadowing of what Messiah would do 5 centuries later once he arrives on the scene. And as the new Moses, as the new Joshua, he is combined together into one person, bringing about not only this spiritual deliverance, but the new conquest that's going to become part of it. But just as Israel's former exodus from the exile she had in Egypt was fraught with people who wanted to rebel and reject, so this one will be as well. And that's what Jesus is driving at, the narrow way that's running counter current to the direction everybody else is walking in. Just because they seemingly have subjected or convinced themselves that they've subjected themselves to God's law and are being obedient Jews by following the letter does not mean their hearts truly belong to the Lord. And by virtue of that, they're going to be cast out. Whereas those who outwardly seem like they might not belong because they're tax collectors or whatever the case might be, as it says in Isaiah 56, though a person might be a foreigner, if they keep his Sabbath without desecrating it and remain faithful to his covenant, they will be accepted as priests. They will bring burnt offerings. They will render sacrifices on his altar, and he will accept them. He will hear their prayers, and this temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, a complete paradigm flip. So, time has run out. We've got a couple lessons left. should be here the next couple of weeks to teach them. I don't think I have anything else on the schedule that's going to come. But if you're listening to this, then just know, fair warning in advance, about maybe 5-ish weeks from now, should be finishing up the Isaiah study on Wednesday night. And then usually after I'm done with these Wednesday night classes, I normally revert back to going into doing the Sunday school workshop from the hour of 6 to 7:30. I don't know what the staff has planned for me. So if we're going to keep this going, I might wind up teaching 2 different sessions of this kind of thing on Wednesdays, a more elaborate version during the actual time that Brother Bart is in here teaching. I don't know, but just more to follow on that. So with that being said, and no further questions, I appreciate your time.